The long hot summer of 1945. This is part 2, the story from June to July of 1945, as Japan's situation deteriorated, but the Japanese government stood firm against anything like surrender, while their cities burned to the ground. We'll also look at the Japanese plans for the defense of the home islands and the U.S. plans for the invasion, and maybe some thoughts about how it would go. Part 3 will cover August, the atomic bombings, the attempted coup in Tokyo, and the ultimate events that led to the Japanese surrender. So I'm going to talk about the war, the atomic bomb, the chaos in the Japanese government, and occasional digressions into the antics of physicist Leo Szilard, the most prominent of the don't drop the bomb advocates, but as we will see, for all the wrong reasons. So what's the situation in June? Japan is pretty much losing the war in every way possible. Their conquests in Southeast Asia are lost. The islands in the Pacific are lost. The Japanese Navy's ability to strike at the U.S. Navy is non-existent, except for a few submarines. The only use for Japanese planes is to dive on U.S. Navy ships, largely unsuccessfully. B-29s roam the skies over Japan at will. The home islands are beginning to starve to death. The waters around the home islands are full of mines, so nothing comes from the mainland, although the Japanese have given up on importing food back in 1944. But now it's becoming more and more critical. Most of the good units in the Army of Manchuria have been shipped out through the war to other places, India and the islands, and destroyed there. The Chinese are pushing the Japanese out of their conquest from just last year. So not just defeat, but extinction stares Japan in the face. U.S. soldiers, sailors, and Marines still show a willingness to fight and die, and the Americans have proven to be better at fighting than the Japanese, largely because they use more and better weapons than the Japanese have. The proof of all this is that thousands of Japanese surrendered on Okinawa, as we will see. Japan really has no hope. However, Japan's leaders are searching for a way to begin negotiations with the U.S. But it is very important to realize what the Japanese are after. They very specifically are not looking to surrender under any terms. They are not looking to surrender at all. What the Japanese are looking for is peace, but with no surrender. The Japanese terms, which they will insist on right up into August. Number 1, no occupation of Japan at all. No disarming or dissolution of the Japanese military. Number 2, no stripping of Japan of its current conquests, Manchuria, Korea, and Formosa, and as much China as they can get away with. Korea and Formosa are colonies, and Manchuria is an independent ally. So according to the Japanese, the colonies are as much part of Japan as the home islands, and Manchuria, being an independent country, is not Japan's to surrender, and they don't want to give any of these up. Number 3, no change in the status of the emperor. Not changing the status of the emperor means that if there is any occupation, the occupiers are under the orders of the emperor. Yeah, they really think that. Ridiculous, but they think it. And last, no war crimes trials at all. Since the Japanese deny pretty much all war crimes to this day, this is hardly surprising. So really the Japanese hope for a peace in place. The Americans go away, and Japan stays as it is now. These 4 conditions will be packaged a number of different ways, but these are they. For instance, conquests are sometimes referred to as imperial lands. Implicit in all this is the Japanese belief that the Americans are stupid, and if the Japanese can just get them to a negotiating table, the Japanese will be able to outmaneuver the Americans and get the peace they want. They will eventually decide to offer one condition, they call, to accept everything in a surrender except the supremacy of the emperor, which is basically all 4 conditions, but described as one condition. The U.S. wants an unconditional surrender, despite gibbering from the State Department in the United States to give the Japanese essentially what they're asking for now. The Japanese want no surrender at all. Later historians, and I use that term with extreme prejudice, will later rewrite this history to suit themselves. Largely that the Japanese were ready to surrender as soon as possible, and it was those evil Americans who insisted on killing as many of Japanese as possible. So let's get into June and July, where the threads of all this begin to come together. In between the date slides I'll be showing you, scenes of combat that is still going on, nothing gory. Men and women are still fighting and killing and dying. The war goes on every day. Oh, and don't get too wrapped up in the old evil Americans, innocent Japanese malarkey. In some, everybody did evil things, but the U.S. is more willing to talk about it, and the Japanese are willing to deny anything bad happened at all, despite incontrovertible evidence, including from the Japanese themselves, that it happened. Murderous Japanese cruelty did happen. Oh, and one of the things that the Japanese claim for denying all this is because school students, children, will be upset by all of this. And I'm not making that up. Of course, the real purpose of all this is to just sort of wipe away even the thought of such a thing for every generation born after the war. And this has largely worked. But I'll try and put off any more of this particular discussion until maybe a fourth video on racism. And racism by the United States and Japan and Canada. You don't get left out. We know what you've done. So now on to that awful summer of 1945. On June 1st, the U.S. Interim Committee, a high-level advisory committee on the use of atomic bombs, recommends that atomic bombs be used on Japanese military targets, that is, cities housing military bases, which is basically all of them, without prior warning of the unique behavior of the atomic bombs. One bomb, one city, and all that. Oh, and aside on warnings, individual Japanese cities had been warned about being firebombed. For instance, in July, Amori, Ishiyama, Tu, Ujiyamado, Ogata, and Uwajim were all warned the day before they were to be firebombed by a leaflet. In the period of May to July 1945, the United States Air Force dropped 60 million leaflets warning of upcoming raids. This gave the Japanese the opportunity to evacuate civilians from targeted areas. Now, the reason for these warnings was not entirely humanitarian. The hope was that since proof of the effect of firebombing had been shown and known at Tokyo in March and later, that civilian morale would be so low that the Japanese government would have to give up or face an uprising from their own people to end the war. The actual Japanese response? They made it illegal for a citizen to keep one of the leaflets. After June 1st, not counting the atomic bombings, 100 Japanese cities will have been bombed, mostly with firebombs. 60 of them will be over half obliterated. So how much extra warning does the Japanese government need? On the same day, Truman's Memorial Day message to Congress makes no modification on unconditional surrender and explicitly warns the Japanese that to rely on U.S. war weariness is foolish. He says he will not seek or accept any negotiated end to the war. Unconditional surrender, and only that will end the war. However, this and many other no-deal messages are interpreted by the Japanese as a sort of first position in negotiations, and they will be able to engineer around those. That's not true, but that's what they thought. Also on June 1st, B-29s start firebombing cities in daylight because there are no Japanese interceptors to speak of. Today's bombing of Osaka, for example, burned out 3.5 square miles of the city. With other bombings, that's 14.5 square miles of Osaka now being ashes. Meanwhile, on Okinawa, the dying goes on and on. Kamikaze attacks continue, but are becoming less and less effective as U.S. defenses become more sophisticated. And those defenses would be even more sophisticated in a landing, as we'll get to. On the 3rd of June, the emperor sends out personal representatives, that is to say, not members of the hierarchy, the military hierarchy, to investigate the actual preparations for the defense of the home islands. He clearly does not believe the bellicose reports of the Army and Navy about the possibility of success when the U.S. invades. 2 of these representatives go to Kujikura Hama Beach east of Tokyo, which might be used as an invasion beach of Honshu. The Army has crowed that the beach is impregnable, but the 2 representatives report back to the emperor that there are basically no beach fortifications there at all. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Leo Szilard's latest machinations to make himself controller of the building and use of atomic bombs, and essentially, as we'll see, to control the world, get off the ground as he engineers a group will write a report that he hopes will influence the Interim Committee on Atomic Bomb Use. Meanwhile, B-29s, this may sound like a rush of events, but this goes on. We're rushing toward A-bombs. B-29s of the 509th Composite Group, that's the unit that will drop A-bombs, begin leaving the United States for Tinian for additional training. By the end of the month, most of the B-29s for the atomic bombing unit will be at Tinian. On the 8th, the Big Six, which we've talked about, meets in Tokyo with the Emperor. They all agree that Japan should fight to the death rather than surrender in any way. Their declaration of the meeting says, quote, "In the belief in giving 7 lives for the country as its inspiration, And based on the strength of its advantaged geographical position and the unity of its people, the Japanese Empire will prosecute the war to the end to preserve the national polity and defend the imperial land, and thereby accomplish the objective of the military mission, unquote. The 7 lives phrase comes from Japanese history, where a famous general is said to say that he wishes he had 7 lives to give to serve Japan. This was in 1336. The unofficial motto of the kamikazes is 7 lives for the emperor. That national polity reference is the government and the military of Japan, with the emperor still at the top as a living god. The Japanese still believe they can maneuver to a peace with no consequences. Well, except for all those dead people. After the meeting, keeper of the Privy Seal Kido asked the emperor what he thought of the meeting, and the statement the empire had just given his assent to. Hirohito says that he thought everybody was waiting for someone else to speak up and say something other than the usual platitudes about ending the war and fighting to the death and so on. Kido tells the emperor that they were waiting. They were waiting for Hirohito. But Hirohito still refuses to intervene in any way, and will for another 2 months while the war goes on. The next day, the chief of staff of the Japanese army reports to the emperor that the Japanese army in Manchuria is the equivalent of about 8 U.S. divisions. That's about 125,000 men. And they have enough ammunition stockpiled to fight one large battle, but only that. The emperor dryly notes that those troops are better than those in the home islands. But he still makes no moves whatsoever to influence the fight to the end policy of the Big Six. He sensed that a Japanese Diet, that is the legislative body of Japan, that, quote, "This is truly the opportunity to crush the evil designs of the enemy nations and fulfill the purpose of the Holy War and manifest the glory of our nation," unquote. Apologists for Hirohito will later say that he was trying to end the war already. But if he wants to end the war, he's not doing a very good job of it. As we've seen, Hirohito is looking for a peace, all right, but one that affects his status in no way whatsoever. On the 12th of June, Leo Szalard's recommendations from the Chicago Metallurgical Lab, part of the Manhattan Project, are delivered to the Interim Committee. Although it's called the Frank Report, it's Leo Szalard's from beginning to end. It declares that there must be international control of atomic weapons and radioactive bomb-making materials after the war. We'll come back to that. It also suggests a demonstration of the A-bomb on a, quote, desert or barren island, unquote. The demonstration it proposes, oddly enough, does not include representatives from Japan. So how do you expect to convince the Japanese to believe anything about a successful test, much less an unsuccessful test? Implicit in the Frank Report is a soft peace with Japan, essentially Japan's own condition, and that's something that simply will not be acceptable to the U.S. public. But the real dynamite, if you will, is Leo Szalard's political pronouncements. And that dynamite is that any use of atomic weapons, even a demonstration, will lead to an arms race with other countries. And yes, that does contradict what he just said. Szalard either doesn't know that the arms race with the Russians is already underway and has been because the Russians have been stealing nuclear secrets for years, or he just doesn't care. The Frank Report says that to avoid nuclear attack on the United States, quote, protection can only come from the political organization of the world, unquote. This international authority can thus impose world peace by controlling all nuclear weapons. But wait, there's more. This international authority will be empowered to use atomic bombs on anybody the authority decides is resorting to force. If you don't do this, Szalard says, that would require the United States to disperse its cities to avoid major destruction. Yes, Leo says, and says many times, so we'll have to remake our entire society if we don't do what Leo says, or we all die. He says we must all be ready to sacrifice our own sovereignty to save ourselves from nuclear war. Yes, world government specified by Leo Szalard, or we all die. Sovereignty or not, this world government, says Szalard, quote, given mutual trust, admitting international control of certain phases of national economy, the control of which could be exercised, unquote. So now this international control organization will dictate how countries' economies will operate. This is a planned world economy, specified by Leo Szalard, or we all die. It reads like a petulant 15-year-old, convinced he can remake the world better if everyone will just do what he says. You've all seen these things. You've probably written them yourself. And this is not Leo's last try at what he claims is the only rational future, run by Leo Szalard, or we all die. All this has come down in popular history as the Manhattan Project scientists all opposed to the use of the atomic bomb on Japan. that this flies in the face of the non-participation of most such scientists in the Frank Report at Hanford, Oak Ridge, and Los Alamos. Largely, this rewriting of history is by Leo himself and those whose political objectives are helped by this absurd narration. In Los Alamos, scientists and engineers continued to work feverishly on building both kinds of atomic bombs. Even though the Germans have already surrendered, the part of this narrative is that the scientists were willing to use the bomb on Germany, but not Japan. Well, that's a lie. Oppenheimer believes that Szilard is almost unbelievably naive, which he is. When Szilard's Frank Report is presented to the interim committee, it's given all the credence it deserves. That is, none. Acolytes of the Szilard view of history declare that since the committee doesn't even bother to forward it to Truman, the evil men of the committee stifled Szilard's enlightened plan for the future. The idea that Truman would have his entire worldview changed, and the country would have smiled, forgetting their dead sons, starting at Pearl Harbor, and embrace Leo's wisdom is the thinking of a child. Hi there, Leo. In Tokyo, Navy Admiral Hasegawa reports to the emperor that in his inspection of naval forces, which includes the various suicide vessels, will be totally unable to slow, much less stop an invasion. The famous high-speed suicide boats, for instance, are actually powered by used car engines and couldn't operate at any high speed anyway, because they are not constructed to take those stresses. There's a flashy powerboat prototype, but its building techniques are impossible in practice for large numbers. Also, the young men who will supposedly bravely smash into enemy ships are inadequately trained to the task. Prince Higashikuni, the emperor's uncle, reports that in his inspections of Honshu, he has found coastal defenses are poorly equipped and troops badly trained. So also are the combat divisions intended to attack the landed Americans. Iron, he says, is so scarce that even shovels to build fortifications have to be made from salvaged fragments of bombs dropped by the Americans. On the 14th, General Grove's targeting committee gives Marshall their list of cities as candidates for atomic bombing. In order, they are Kyoto, Hiroshima, Kokura, and Niigata. All have significant industrial plant and war-related installations. Later, Stimson will demand Kyoto be removed from the list. On the 25th, a city will replace Kyoto, Nagasaki. On the same day, the Japanese Foreign Ministry asked the Soviet ambassador in Tokyo about some form of economic and military cooperation between the two countries. The Russians give a non-answer answer. On the 15th, Japanese Unit 9420 is shut down and personnel and assets are transferred to Singapore. Although not as famous as Unit 731, of which more will be heard later, Unit 9420 was a biological warfare research unit which concentrated on bubonic plague and malaria as attack vectors. For the plague, the unit had its own flea farm, using 30,000 rats shipped there from Japan to maintain the supply. No, I'm not making that up. The existence of Unit 9420 was unknown outside a few in Japan until the 1970s, when former staffers began to come forward to tell their stories. Almost all records of 9420 were destroyed before and just after the war by the Japanese. That almost happened with Unit 731, as we will see. A U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff study on the Olympic and Coronet landings on Kyushu and Honshu predicts a total of 550,000 casualties, of which 110,000 will be killed. For Olympic, military planners believe the Japanese have 300,000 troops on Kyushu. That number is really wrong, and will get wronger as the summer goes on. By the way, MacArthur's estimate for the first 30 days of Olympic is 31,000 killed and wounded. 31,000. MacArthur is intent on making sure the invasion, his invasion, is not put off by fear of casualties. For comparison, when the fighting is over for the tiny island of Okinawa, 12,500 U.S. troops are dead, and 36,000 are wounded. In Tokyo, Keeper of the Privy Seal Kido meets with Foreign Minister Togo to pass along the Emperor's suggestion that the Russians be contacted to perhaps mediate negotiations. The Emperor is entirely unaware that that's already happening. His own foreign ministry has just not bothered to tell him. On the 16th, Oppenheimer goes to talk to the interim committee on the use of the atomic bomb to argue against any sort of demonstration. No warning must be given, he says, for maximum effect on the Japanese government. The committee will make its official recommendation to Truman, no warning, first use on a city, and as soon as possible. This, the interim committee says, is the best way to use the bomb to try and end the war as soon as possible. It is perhaps a measure of how little Szilard's self-serving foolishness is paid attention to is that nobody's paying attention to it. On the 18th, Prime Minister Suzuki tells the rest of the Big Six that the emperor wants to seek peace as soon as possible. The use of the word peace versus surrender is very important. Remember, the Japanese plan would have no actual surrender, just a negotiated peace that would leave Japan's government, military, and possessions in place. Nevertheless, after the war, this is seized upon by the usual suspects as Japanese desire to surrender. It is not. On the 19th, the Japanese air units based in Kyushu and intended for kamikaze attacks on the Olympic invasion are found to be without radio, since all the radio part manufacturers have been bombed. Later this month, Japanese reports will say that only half of these planes are flyable at all. On Okinawa, 343 Japanese troops surrender. This is the largest single surrender of Japanese troops in the entire war to date, but not for long. Tomorrow, over 1,000 Japanese troops will surrender on Okinawa. But the fighting on Okinawa still has a week to go. On the 21st, the last Japanese kamikaze attack on the Okinawa support fleet damages 7 small ships, those smaller than destroyers, and sinks only 1. On Okinawa, 7,000 Japanese troops surrender. Now, for the Japanese, surrendering is a sign of absolute hopelessness. And so this might point to an easier time, for some definition of easier, for the fighting to come on Kyushu. Many Japanese soldiers also commit suicide. The next day, all organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa ends. From invasion to victory, the battle has lasted 82 days. The Japanese have lost over 100,000 men, almost all killed, but 10,000 have surrendered. The Japanese have very few wounded because they typically kill their own wounded. The Japanese had hoped that high casualties on Okinawa would make the Americans recoil and want to begin negotiations right away for a peace on Japan's terms. Those are wrong, as they have been wrong all the way back to Pearl Harbor. The Japanese have been telling themselves that one great victory and the Americans will give it up. At Okinawa, the U.S. Navy has lost 32 ships, all destroyer size or less, with 368 being damaged one way or another off Okinawa. Again, the emperor tells the Big Six that negotiations should be pursued, but only via the Russians. Direct contact with the United States in any form is expressly forbidden. On the 23rd, the Japanese government enacts a law making all men aged 15 to 60 and all women aged 17 to 40 automatically members of the defense militia. These men and women will initially be used to dig fortifications, but in the event of a landing, will be armed with grenades, small arms, and famously bamboo sticks to defend Kyushu. Nearly half the total population of Japan is now, by definition, in the military, and by the Geneva Convention that makes them legitimate targets. On June 29th, Truman approves the 2 invasion plan. The invasions are planned to involve the use of 5 million soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. The same day, the Japanese make another offer to the Russians via the Tokyo embassy, fishing rights in Japanese waters for the Russians in exchange for shipments of oil, which the Japanese are rapidly running out of. The Japanese further promised to demilitarize Manchuria after the war, and an extension of the Russian neutrality treaty with Japan, which officially ran out in mid-May. The Russians are unmoved. Somewhere around now, the Japanese Army and Navy begin destroying documents from the 1930s and 40s, obviously in an attempt to avoid war crimes trials. This will leave many important documents to be found only in overseas archives. This has allowed evasionists in Japan to declare that, for instance, the famous kill-all order, of which more will be heard later, did not exist, because records of it are only to be found overseas. They're not found in Tokyo because they burned them. So, at the highest level of the war, nothing has really changed all through June. The United States is just grinding the Japanese down, and the Japanese still believe they are masters of their fate. On July 1st, Japanese Imperial Headquarters issues an analysis of the upcoming battle for the home islands. They believe the U.S. will invade Kyushu with 30 divisions in late 1945 and Honshu with 50 divisions in 1946. However, they say that rather than a defense in depth, like on Okinawa and other islands, to drag out the battle and inflict maximum casualties over time, they will attack the landing forces with every unit they can bring to bear as soon as it is available. They intend to try and throw the U.S. forces back into the sea. Politically, this analysis says, quote, should the United States be defeated in the battle for Japan itself, it is inevitable that the confidence in Truman and the military will be lost, unquote. Truman himself is described as being inexperienced and will be unable to combine his political and military policies anytime soon. Quote, this factor is further detriment to a brief Pacific War, unquote. That is, if the U.S. invasion fails, the war will go on and presumably Japan will have an advantage when negotiations come along. In reality, this analysis of Truman and the U.S. attitude is completely detached from reality. In reality, even if an invasion were to fail, Operation Starvation would cause the Japanese people to simply begin dropping dead for lack of food and the diseases of malnourishment. Japanese industrial production, with no raw materials from the mainland, will just grind to a halt. The Japanese, with no cards to play, are still insisting to each other that they do. Concerning the kamikazes in the event of a landing, a report from Captain Genda at Kobe says that only half of his aircraft are capable of flying, much less fighting, much less diving on American ships, and don't have enough fuel to reach Okinawa to attack the support fleet still off the island. Implicit in this is that the Japanese don't have enough fuel to even train their pilot. On the second, Secretary of War Henry Stimson writes to Truman to say that there are two groups of leaders in Japan, the, quote, liberal, unquote, Japanese, who are being held down by the, quote, terrorists, unquote. He says that appealing somehow to these liberal Japanese who have, quote, mental intelligence and versatile capacity, unquote, will somehow be able to use this smartness in their shiny shoes to overcome the terrorists. And in so doing, they will accept unconditional surrender. Although it seems that Stimson's appeal to Truman would have to include conditions in unconditional surrender. Stimson's memo is a little hard to follow. But Stimson has completely missed what's happening in Japan politically. Either that or he's just making stuff up to make himself feel better. If you're catching a theme here, you're not wrong. Neither side seems to have any appreciation of the actual situation in the other's political leadership. Neither side has fully thought through their own political positions. The war's on automatic. Just keep killing and see what happens. On July 3rd, Leo Szilard tries to impose his will on Truman again, sending a petition he says is signed by the scientists at the Met Lab, which turn out to be administrators, graduate students, and others, fewer than 20% of which are actual physicists, amending the Frank Report, now telling Truman to not use atomic bombs on Japan for any reason. It declares that the Japanese, based on no information whatsoever, are just looking for a way to surrender, which they are decidedly not doing. On the 7th, Hirohito asked Prime Minister Suzuki what's become of contacts with the Soviets. When told nothing is happening, the emperor suggests a personal envoy from himself to Stalin be sent to Moscow to lend weight to the attempts to approach Stalin. It will take a week to select Prince Kokoye to send to Moscow. In the short term, Molotov will refuse to meet with the prince when he shows up, claiming he's too busy preparing for the upcoming Potsdam meetings. On the 11th, Togo sends to Ambassador Sato in Moscow that he should tell the Russians that Japan has, quote, no thought of annexing or retaining the territories under her occupation, unquote. This is a pretty transparent attempt to influence the Russians and, through them, the Americans. See, Korea is not occupied. It's a colony. Manchuria is not occupied. It's an independent allied country. Formosa is a colony. So what exactly are the Japanese offering? Not much, it turns out. To make things even murkier, Togo orders Sato to, quote, while there is no question as to your skill, please be careful in your conference to avoid the impression that our plan is to make use of the Russians in ending the war, unquote. That's exactly what he plans to do. The Japanese have been talking to the Soviet ambassador in Tokyo to make use of the Russians in ending the war. So the Japanese by now are double-thinking themselves, enforcing their own delusions that they are in any way masters of their own fate. Today's Nippon Times, an English-language newspaper published in Tokyo and often used by the government to plant stories intended for a Western audience, described how doomed a U.S. landing on the home islands is. The facts used to back this up include that a Japanese soldier is, quote, absolutely superior in fighting quality than the Americans, and that a U.S. soldier landed at Normandy used up 18 tons of shipping capacity, and in the landing on Kyushu, a U.S. soldier will somehow require 54 tons when invading, which means that the U.S., with only 5 million tons of capacity, can land only 1 million men. Still with me? Yeah, I don't understand it either. The article then enthusiastically describes the Japanese Air Force, which will sink the entire invasion fleet and destroy the landing force. Quote, if the enemy's losses are heavy enough, we can earn time while the enemy will be forced to reconstruct her fleet. It is not impossible to repeat such a feat every time the enemy should attempt such a landing, unquote. So the Japanese are still hoping to influence the American populace that they might lose everything. On the 12th, parts for the Trinity nuclear test at Alamogordo are taken there by car. The plutonium core is in the back of a sedan. Some of the explosive lenses are in another car's trunk. That car is pulled over by the police for speeding. Fortunately, the police don't search the car, or they would have found some of the several thousand pounds of hard-to-explain hexalite explosives to be used in the bomb. In Tokyo, the emperor finally meets with Prince Konoye to take up the special envoy role. The emperor says the prince is to try and convince the Russians to mediate negotiations with the Americans. The emperor directs that the prince find out what conditions can be made in an unconditional surrender and send them direct to the emperor, that is to say, not through diplomatic channels. Two things about this. First, the emperor doesn't seem to recognize the irony of conditions for an unconditional surrender, and the emperor doesn't trust his own military and diplomatic corps at all. Meanwhile, Keeper of the Privy Seal Quito writes in his diary that his fear is that in the event of a surrender, there may be a communist-led uprising of an enraged populace. This bugaboo of a communist uprising will color the thoughts of everyone in the Japanese leadership all through the rest of the war. But perhaps a more realistic threat, as we will see, to the Imperial Japanese government is the Imperial Japanese Army. The Army has a history of intervening in Japanese politics when it suits them, and will again in August. On July 14th, the assembly of the Gadget, the nickname for the plutonium bomb, is completed at the top of a 100-foot tower. Now it's just minor adjustments for the test. Meanwhile, U.S. task forces are cruising up and down the Japanese coast, shelling factories and coastal cities, and shooting up Japanese airfields. There is no opposition whatsoever from Japanese naval and air units. They're all being saved for the big fight on Kyushu. At a meeting of the Big Six in Tokyo, Prime Minister Suzuki tells the others that Prince Kanoye is being sent to Moscow. He asks the Big Six to formulate the conditions Japan should try to obtain. After extended debate, the Big Six are unable to agree on anything about such conditions. So the prince, who's now unable to make any sort of proposal because the Japanese can't decide what proposal to give, never winds up going to Moscow at all. On the 15th, thunderstorms begin over Alamogordo. Nobody's sure exactly what will happen if the tower is hit by lightning, but the storm passes early in the morning of the 16th. At 5 a.m., the final arming of the Gadget is done. At 5:29, the Gadget explodes with the power of 18,000 tons of TNT. In later parlance, that's 18 kilotons. The 100-foot tall tower is vaporized, and a crater half a mile wide and 8 feet deep is carved out of the desert. The flash from the bomb is seen 280 miles away in Amarillo, Texas. The shockwave breaks windows in Silver City, 180 miles away. The Army's cover story is that an ammunition dump in the desert has exploded, which is successful. Meanwhile, parts of the uranium bomb, which is judged not to be needing testing because it's just too stupid to fail, are put on board the USS Indianapolis to take to Tinian. The rest goes by air. The next day, on the 17th, Stalin, Truman, and Churchill meet at Potsdam to decide the future of Europe and also Japan. Good old Leo Szilard tries again to be relevant by giving a petition signed by 70 scientists, which again is not very many scientists, to the interim committee. In it, Szilard says, quote, if such public announcement gave assurance to the Japanese that they could look forward to a life devoted to peaceful pursuit in their homeland, and if Japan still refused to surrender, our nation might then, in certain circumstances, find itself forced to resort to the use of atomic bombs. Such a step, however, ought to not be made at any time without seriously considering the moral responsibilities which are involved, unquote. The final paragraph of the petition says, quote, in view of the foregoing, we, the undersigned, respectfully petition, first, that you exercise your power as Commander-in-Chief to rule that the United States shall not resort to the use of atomic bombs in this war unless the terms which will be imposed upon Japan have been made public in detail, and that Japan, knowing these terms, has refused to surrender. Second, that in such an event, the question whether or not to use atomic bombs shall be decided by you in the light of consideration presented in this petition, as well all the other moral responsibilities which are involved. The Japanese have been given terms. Unconditional surrender. They've been given publicly. The Japanese have refused such a surrender despite cataclysmic damage, at least since March in the firebombing of Tokyo. They've been called on to surrender unconditionally since January 1943. They were promised at that time that the Japanese people would be able to live peacefully if the war makers were removed. So Leo apparently has not read a newspaper in several years, or is just trying to elbow his way into being influential. Guess which choice I believe? At Potsdam, Stalin informs Truman that he intends to invade Manchuria on August 15th, in fidelity to his pledge at Yalta to attack Japan within 3 months of a German surrender. He also shows the latest communication from the Japanese to the Russians, the mediator one, to Churchill and Truman. Stalin asked them what he should do, suggesting that he keep the Japanese on the hook while he prepares to attack Japan. Truman agrees. Stalin's response to the Japanese for a meeting with Prince Kanoye is that the Japanese proposals are, quote, too general, unquote, and need clarification. The prince's proposed visit is waved away, the Russians saying that his mission is not specific, and this will create the usual chaos within the Japanese government as careful planning has been thrown out the window. The Japanese military attitude about a fight in Kyushu is encapsulated in a declaration on the 19th that, quote, "We will prepare 10,000 planes to meet the landing of the enemy. We will mobilize every aircraft possible, both training and, quote, special attack, unquote, planes. We will smash 1/3 of the enemy's war potential with this air force at sea. Another third will be smashed at sea by our warships, human torpedoes, and other special weapons. Furthermore, when the enemy actually lands, if we are ready to sacrifice 1,000,000 men, we will be able to inflict an equal number of casualties upon them. If the enemy loses 1,000,000 men, then public opinion in America will become inclined towards peace, and Japan will be able to gain peace with comparatively advantageous conditions," unquote. The same declaration will be made at a meeting of the Big Six in August. This is defining the one big victory to end the war that Japan has been searching for since December 7th, 1941. Yet they believe that it is not only possible, it is inevitable. The emperor meets with the Big Six, supposedly telling them, quote, "Please proceed to terminate the war as quickly as possible," unquote. Problem with this quotation is that the emperor is on record of still supporting the continuing war in search of a no occupation, no loss of territory, and so on conditions. He will continue to support the war this way for another 7 weeks. So this is either a mistranslation or a self-serving untruth to be used after the war. Meanwhile, Japanese Ambassador Sato in Moscow sends to Foreign Minister Togo, quote, "I recommend acceptance of virtually any terms," unquote. All through this summer, the only Japanese voice of sanity and clear-eyed analysis is Sato's. But Togo will respond, quote, "We cannot accept unconditional surrender under any circumstances," unquote. Sato will respond to that, quote, "It is meaningless to prove one's devotion to the emperor by wrecking the state," unquote. Togo's response to that is unequivocal. Japan, quote, "will pit itself against the enemy in accordance with the imperial will as long as the enemy demands unconditional surrender," unquote. All this is shortly intercepted and decoded by U.S. intelligence. So the U.S. knows that the Japanese are flopping around trying to find some exit. Meanwhile, an official radio broadcast to the Japanese from the United States tell them they have two choices: unconditional surrender or utter destruction. This is in anticipation of the upcoming Potsdam Declaration. Meanwhile, a supposed U.S. disinformation agency by the name of L.S. Zacharias has been broadcasting for a couple of years without any answer from the Japanese that he has a direct line to the president and can broker negotiations. Yeah, this is actual treason, but Zacharias has been able, since the war ended, to cast himself as a sort of puppet master, making Truman and the emperor dance to his tune. Today he broadcast to the Japanese that they can surrender and, quote, "enjoy the benefits of the Atlantic Charter," unquote. The supposed offer, pretty much the softest of any soft peace, is in direct contravention of years of U.S. policy. It's balderdash. But the Japanese will seize upon this, and as we will see, use it to continue to fight on, costing hundreds of thousands of Japanese their lives as they are bombed and shelled and starved and bombed. In my opinion, Mr. Zacharias is a self-serving moron, one of several who appeared in the U.S. and Japan throughout the summer of 1945. On the 24th, Truman tells Stalin about the successful test of the atomic bomb, though without any details, including whether it's atomic or not. Stalin responds that he hopes it is used on the Japanese as soon as possible. The lack of any other response, including asking for details, mystifies the British and U.S. people at Potsdam. Of course, Stalin by now is better informed of what happened at Alamogordo and Los Alamos than either Churchill or Truman. The Japanese National Radio Network, NHK, broadcast an actual response to L.S. Zacharias in English. And it says that if the U.S. were to offer actual negotiations based around the Atlantic Charter with the understanding that no punishment of Japan or lost sovereignty, blah, 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 they would be interested. The U.S. Navy is suddenly made aware of the hash Zacharias is making of the entire war. The Navy, of which Zacharias is a member, forbids him to go near a microphone. Ever. Too late, really. On the 26th, the Potsdam Declaration is issued in the name of Churchill, Truman, and Chiang Kai-shek. The Russians, remember, are not at war with Japan yet. It says that Japan must learn from the ruination of Germany what's awaiting them. It says that the Japanese must throw off their leaders who started the war in the first place. It promises that although there will be war crime trials, no reprisals will be inflicted on the general population. Japan's non-military economy will be allowed to be rebuilt. Although Japan will be occupied, the Allies will leave as soon as they're sure the Japanese will not pursue military conquest again. It continues that all possessions outside the home islands are to be given up, the military is to be disarmed and demobilized, and a change of Japan politically from a sort of feudal model to a representative democracy. It ends, quote, If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware." Unquote. Hell's coming with me and all that. The status of the emperor after a surrender is not addressed. Since the Russians are not a signatory of the declaration, the Japanese will seize on this to believe that Stalin is still willing to act as a mediator. That they have no basis for this is irrelevant. They're grasping at straws now. The next day, Prime Minister Suzuki responds to the Potsdam Declaration. He says that Japan will treat it with mokusatsu. For such a crucial communication, Suzuki has used a curiously ambiguous word. Even in Japanese, it has many meanings. It could mean to kill with silence, to take no notice of, to reject by ignoring, and several others. Now, in reporting Suzuki's response, Radio Tokyo says that the meaning of the word in this context is to ignore the declaration entirely. The Allies in Potsdam understandably take this to mean a Japanese rejection of the surrender demand. After all, the Japanese had just announced that interpretation themselves. After his mokusatsu response, the emperor called Suzuki and military representatives to a conference. At it, the emperor asked them all to, quote, "consider methods for ending the war. State your real opinion," unquote. This might seem strange, but the emperor is fully aware that the Big Six, for example, are telling him things they think he wants to hear or things they think they have to say. He doesn't get what he wants. Admiral Yanai, chief of the Navy staff, announces that since, quote, "Churchill has fallen, the U.S. is now isolated," unquote. Now he's referring to Churchill's being voted out as prime minister in England during the Potsdam negotiations. Yanai thinks that since the U.S. is now isolated, the Japanese can just wait them out. Yeah, I don't get that either. On the 30th, Ambassador Sato in Moscow responds to the flurry of messages from Tokyo about what he should do, that he really can't do anything until Tokyo decides what he should offer to the Russians about ending the war. Meanwhile, he asked the Russians if they could revise the Potsdam Declaration to include the phrase that Japan's, quote, "honor and existence are guaranteed," unquote, as part of some sort of compromise peace. He's grasping at straws, but it's all he has until Tokyo makes up his mind. In any case, his suggestion never makes it to Potsdam. I suspect that honor and existence is Sato's way of trying to finesse the surrender by allowing honor to include non-occupation, non-disarmament, no war crimes, and all that. Even at this late date, the Japanese believe they can hoodwink the Americans with ambiguous phrases. Meanwhile, the Americans are answering with the same old concrete ones. Unconditional surrender. So that's the end of July. Both the U.S. and Japan are rushing toward a cataclysm, the invasion of the home islands, and of course atomic bomb. Nobody seems to be able to stop it or want to. But a few more sledgehammer blows and a lot more death, and it will finally end. We'll see about August next time. So now let's talk a little bit about the military's plans for each side for an invasion. This is a little bit of a thought experiment. We'll have to wave away the effect of atomic bombing. Either the bombs aren't available or they don't have the desired effect on the Japanese. The emperor doesn't intervene to force the Big Six to stop the war. Whatever it is, the invasions happen. The Japanese plan is pretty simple. Wait for the invasion fleet to appear and attack it with every aircraft available, concentrating on transports. During the actual invasion, attack the landing craft with suicide boats, one-man subs, and men in diving suits waiting to attach a mine to a passing landing craft. Once that's all done, by Japanese estimates, only 1/3 of the original landing force can make it to the shore, and they will attack that with everything available and keep on attacking until the landing is driven into the sea. The only unexpected to the Allies part of this strategy is that Japan intends to throw everything they can into the fight for Kyushu and hold nothing back for the defense of Honshu. The Japanese still are looking for that one great victory that they've been searching for 4 years. One thing the Japanese have not taken into account is that the U.S. Navy has seen every one of the anti-invasion weapons before and has at least some sort of tactic to defend against them. For instance, the mini-subs have been in use since Pearl Harbor. In January 1944, in the Palau Islands, the diving suits that the Japanese intend to use have been tried, and all they can do is damage one LCI. Miniature submarines have been in use by everyone in the European theater and in the Pacific. So the U.S. Navy will find a way to take care of these, probably by just dropping depth charges forever. The U.S. strategy is also simple. They'll just keep hammering away at the home islands by air and sea and wear down the Japanese until they're unable to resist. Then they'll invade. The bombardment of Japan would last from July until November. It's 5 months of just bombing and shelling and bombing to destroy military assets and starve the civilians and the military. The U.S. has essentially an infinite supply of bombs, napalm, and battleship shells, which will do a number on pretty much anything. As part of this bombardment, Operation Starvation will be continued and will include, between August and November, the use of herbicides to spray on rice paddies in the home islands, to deny even that food to the Japanese. That'll be apocalyptic starvation throughout the home islands. The two herbicides to be used, by the way, will find another use in 1962 as part of Jack Kennedy's Operation Ranch Hand in Vietnam. The two herbicides are mixed together and are called Agent Orange. Something the Japanese don't seem to have recognized is that their much relied on kamikaze aircraft were going to be in fewer numbers than described by them. Spare parts are basically non-existent, fuel was unobtainable, and supposed underground bunkers for factories had, even by August, not even begun to being built, much less moving surviving factories into them. Their kamikaze naval assets were nowhere near the strength they have told each other. Claims that the Japanese have stockpiled huge amounts of oil fail in the face of a lack of refineries, since the B-29s have been systematically blowing them to bits. So since there's very little actual fuel, there would be no training for air or naval kamikaze forces. Allied fighters and bombers would just roam the skies and would pounce on anything flying, including kamikazes. Rail and even road transport would be increasingly difficult. When the time for landing support action did come, there would be hordes of Allied day and night fighters pouncing on aircraft with pilots who can barely keep their planes in the air, and will be met by curtains of anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese simply could not conceive of the reign of ruin that they were promised, despite what they've already suffered. Interestingly, in an invasion and fight-to-the-death strategy, neither the U.S. or Japan seriously contemplates the use of poison gas. I think this is an example of deterrent. Both sides know there is nothing to be gained but more death with no real change in the outcome. Nevertheless, the U.S. has stockpiled huge amounts of poison gas at the island base of Ulithi just in case. A Japanese resort to poison gas would have resulted in a massive response, would make the atomic bombs look like nothing. And the Japanese know it. One exception to this no poison gas decision is George Marshall, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. He announces for Japanese resistance, quote, drench them and sicken them so that the fight is taken out of them, unquote. The gas he suggests using is mustard gas. Now, mustard gas does not sicken, it kills. Use on unprotected troops, which in Japan includes all of the militias, would take the fight out of them. That is to say, kill them in the tens of thousands. And given the Japanese plan to attack the beaches, probably millions. Marshall also has amazingly harebrained ideas about atomic bombs. He wants to use nukes on the landing beaches and have U.S. troops walk through the radioactive grounds to fight further inland. He wants to kill Japanese now and U.S. soldiers later. No, really. The U.S. plan after the landing is taking the southern part of Kyushu, stop advancing, dig in, and build a huge complex of air bases to support the coronet landings on Honshu. Casualties on the U.S. side will be high. Casualties amongst the Japanese will be apocalyptic. And remember that the U.S. is still building atomic bombs. They have a third in the pipeline when they drop one on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. According to General Groves, the expectation is that third bomb would be dropped on Tokyo. According to General Groves, the U.S. would have 8 more atomic bombs by early November 1945, just before the projected Olympic invasion, and 5 more after that by January 1946, and 5 more every month after that. So say goodbye to Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, Kobe, Fukuoka, Sendai, Kawasaki, and Sapporo. And that's all before the Olympic invasion. So let's go real quickly as to some options of what might happen. First, both invasions succeed. By the time of the invasion of Kyushu, Japanese military and militia will be starving. So the U.S. will not be presented with waves of properly trained troops, but with ragged men and women staggering toward them. It'll be a turkey shoot. Losing on Kyushu might convince the Japanese to give up, but they might still be searching for that one great victory and just letting their cities to be atomized. Who knows? Olympic fails and Coronet is postponed. For the Japanese, this is not much better. Their air force is expended and not replaceable. Operation Starvation carries out its grim effects on the Japanese people, and this goes on and on and on. At some point, hopefully, the government falls, the emperor is imprisoned by the Japanese, and whoever's left in Japan invites the U.S. to enter and take over. Or the Russians. In these scenarios, Japan will never really recover and become a sad, pitiful version of the industrial powerhouse it has become. So whichever way you look at it, the U.S. wins. It's just a matter of how many people have to die. But this analysis is simply not even discussed in Tokyo all through the summer of 1945. Fight, hope, and ignore the dead Japanese. It's the same thinking since March 1945, the fire raid on Tokyo. The Japanese saw the catastrophe that's waiting for them, and they just ignore it. Part 3 of this series will cover the final hammer blows on Japan in August, and the decision by the United States to offer a ray of hope to the Japanese. The atomic bombings, the coup in Tokyo, and the final surrender. Bye-bye.